This is a breaking news report out of the London Chronicle. King George is proud to announce that Your Royal Majesty and his leadership with the Royal Navy and Army have defeated the French. We have been declared the victors of the French and Indian War. Once again, King George III has spread the glory of the Kingdom of England, a kingdom of which the sun truly never sets. And all of you were a part of it. Every single English man, woman, and child who sacrificed for the glory of the English Empire. And now we ask that you sacrifice a little more, that we all pay our fair share in taxes to make sure that we can pay back our war debts and guarantee a prosperous future for the children of the Kingdom of England. We ask that not only the people in England, but all over the English Empire assist in paying for the war. And for that, King George III in Parliament will implement a Sugar Act to tax the American colonists so that they can help pay for the war. This is a breaking news report coming out of the Boston Chronicle. We have received word that England has been victorious in the French and Indian War. The war is coming to an end, and once again, the American colonists have stepped up and fought for the glory of England. But the news isn't all good because apparently King George III doesn't see it that way. After you answered his call, after your brothers and your fathers and your sons answered the call of England and went to war against the French and the Indians, the king is now asking you to pay for that war effort? Have you not paid enough with the blood, sweat, and tears of your fellow countrymen? The king wants to implement a Sugar Act, but the question is, what will that do to your businesses? Does the king want to see colonial businesses fail? We have a report coming out of the London Chronicle. After passing the Sugar Act, the American colonists have not acted in honor. Rather, they've been selfish, refusing to pay their fair share. To this point, they've been protesting and boycotting. Well, the King of England will not stand for that, for everyone was a part of this war and everyone must assist in paying for it. And how will that be done? The King of England and Parliament have announced the implementation of a new Stamp Act so that the American colonies could pay their fair share in a war that the king fought for them. They were surrounded by the French, surrounded by the Indians, and had the king not sent his royal military across an ocean to fight a war, who knows what would have come of the colonists at this point. It is time to stop being selfish and pay your fair share. Tyranny. A breaking news report from the Boston Chronicle. Tyranny is the only way to describe the king's most recent actions. No taxation without representation, King George. What doesn't he get? Every time he taxes the American colonists, without giving them a vote, without giving them a say, without representing them, it is exploitation. The American colonists answered the call of God and country. The American colonists went to war. And why did they do that? Because King George requested it. Was the blood and tears the colonists paid not enough? When will this exploitation come to an end? Breaking news. King George the Reasonable, after hearing the arguments, the complaints of the American colonists, King George III and British Parliament have decided to repeal the Stamp and Sugar Act. King George the Great, the Reasonable, represents all of the people of the kingdom, the Empire of England. The people in London, England, the people in Scotland, and the people in the American colonies are well represented by the greatness of King George. So, being the reasonable man that he is, the Stamp and Sugar Acts will be repealed, but the Declaratory Act will be passed. And the Declaratory Act is just a reminder that the King of England holds the authority to tax any subjects of the English kingdom. Do not forget it. Breaking news out of Boston. The king has revealed how weak he truly is. He has backed down to the American colonists. He has backed down. Our protests, our boycotts have been successful, and the weak king must have heard the little birdies whispering in his ear, Mr. King, please repeal the Stamp and the Sugar Act. The boycotts from the American colonies are hurting English businesses. Look how powerful you are when you come together. The weak king has repealed the Stamp and Sugar Act. But in an effort to save face, what does he do? The Declaratory Acts, saying that he can tax us whenever he wants, not without representation. You do not represent us. You have been exploiting the American colonies, exploiting us for our blood, our sweat and tears in the French and Indian Wars, and exploiting us for our resources after the war, and we will not stand for it. Breaking news. In the king's latest effort to pay back the French and Indian War debt, the king has announced, along with Parliament, the Townsend Acts. Our economists project that this act will help us pay back the war debt in a more timely fashion, securing the future for all English children and all English subjects. The selfish colonists have not wanted to pay their fair share. Well, they have to help pay for this war. Do they believe that only you, the people of England, should have to pay taxes for this war? Wasn't it fought to protect them in the first place? This is a breaking news report out of Boston. In the latest dictate of the tyrant across the sea in England, Parliament is now levying the Townsend Acts, in which they expect American colonists to pay taxes on glass, paper, paint, and tea. Another act of injustice. No taxation without representation. No King George III, King George the Weak, King George the Tyrant. The American people are not represented by you. We demand representatives in English Parliament, or there will be no taxes. Will you protest? Will you boycott? Because if you do, you may see the same success you saw with the repeal of the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. England is punishing the American colonists for the mistakes of a king. This is a breaking news report. A few nights ago, an unruly, drunk man in Boston, Massachusetts, walked into a bar to spend the rest of his night inebriated when he bumped into and insulted an English soldier. In an act of self-defense, that soldier picked up his gun and bashed the colonist over the head, the least amount of force needed. He could have taken his gun and shot the colonist, but he didn't do that. He simply tried to gain order of an unruly drunk man. How was he repaid? An unruly mob surrounded him, throwing objects at him, intimidating him. So, being the good soldiers that they are, 7 other English soldiers came to his defense. And they tried to de-escalate the situation, but the mob got more unruly and more rowdy, throwing stones and rocks and icicles and risking the lives of those English soldiers. Being afraid for their lives, they did what any reasonable man would do, opening fire, and unfortunately, a few lives were lost. And now the colonists are calling for justice? What justice? Should a man attacked by a mob not be able to defend himself? Should those soldiers not have had the right to go home to their family? Breaking news report. This is a somber day in Boston, Massachusetts. A man who was just going about his day walked into a local establishment when the Quartering Act reared its ugly head. He bumped into an English soldier who proceeded to insult him and bash him over the head with a firearm. How many of you have had experiences like this? Walking through the streets and you're harassed by an English soldier. You're in your house, a soldier knocks on your door and asks you to make him dinner, says, "I'm laying in your bed tonight." The Quartering Act. Reprehensible. Well, the colonist was beat with a gun, and a few of the locals saw what had happened, and they did what any good neighbor would do. They came to his defense. And when they did, what happened? 7 more English soldiers came, pointed their guns at the unarmed group of American colonists. Just imagine yourself standing there with no weapon, and these soldiers pointing their guns at you, and they opened fire, killing 3 of your neighbors and wounding 5 more. The American colonists demand justice. This is a breaking news report. Domestic terrorists in Boston, Massachusetts, dressed up as savages in the middle of the night, boarded a ship and threw millions of dollars of Your Majesty's tea into Boston Harbor, destroying the property of English-owned businesses. Do they want English families to starve? These terrorists will be hunted down and prosecuted for their criminal behavior, for no such thing will be tolerated. Breaking news tonight out of Boston, Massachusetts. Local freedom fighters are pushing back in a big way, the biggest way yet. We were all there for the protests and the boycotts of the Sugar Act, and the boycotts after the Stamp Act, and the Quartering Act, and the Towsing Act. But this is the most successful boycott protest yet. The Sons of Liberty, American colonists, boarded an English ship and threw that tyrannical tea into Boston Harbor. Will you stand with these freedom fighters? This is breaking news with the London Chronicle. In the latest escalation of domestic terrorism, colonists in Boston, Massachusetts, at Lexington and Concord, lined up and opened fire, firing their guns and killing, wounding, Your Majesty's soldiers. In this open act of rebellion, the colonists have crossed a line and they are now traitors to the English crown and to the English people. King George III is calling for the arrest of these terrorists and John Hancock and Samuel Adams to be charged with treason. Breaking news tonight out of Boston, Massachusetts. King George III, in his latest act of tyranny, has sent armed soldiers to Lexington and Concord to confiscate, to steal all of the rightfully owned firearms from the Massachusetts militia. Local hero Paul Revere, catching wind of this news, rode through the night warning the American colonists. The colonists intercepted the well-armed English army at Lexington and Concord, asked them politely to leave, and how did the English respond? With war, with revolution, firing at American colonists? Well, the heroic American colonists were able to win the day, and in the end, the English were in retreat. So the question is now, will you stand with your brothers in a revolution in defiance of tyranny? All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed my performance. I was acting out the different events of the American Revolution as being reported by a newspaper in London, which was friendly to King George, versus being reported by a newspaper in Boston, Massachusetts, which was friendly to the cause of the American colonists. And as you can see, news media has the power to paint a picture, right? And they could paint a very different picture of the same event. So, for example, if we look at the Boston Tea Party, the newspaper in London said domestic terrorists and criminals boarded a ship dressed as savages and destroyed millions of dollars of property owned by English business people. What do they want? English business people and their families to starve? The news media depicted the Sons of Liberty and the Boston Tea Party as an act of terrorism, right? That these people were unruly, they were savages. Well, compare that to how the Boston Chronicle reported on the same event, where they called the Sons of Liberty freedom fighters. They said freedom fighters in an act of protest against a tyrannical king threw some tea into the harbor and really made a statement. News media has the power to alter people's perception and how they view events. And the founding fathers were well aware of this. So after they won the war, there was a whole American Revolution, they would win the war, they had to form a new government. And they formed the government under the Constitution of the United States, under this document, right? We the people. And in the Constitution, they added a Bill of Rights. And they addressed news media in that Bill of Rights. The First Amendment to the Constitution reads, and we covered some of this, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging freedom of speech or of the press. The press is the news media. Or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. Congress shall make no law prohibiting or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. So the founding fathers thought that a free press, a free news media, was so important to the freedoms that they wanted their grandchildren to have many years later, that they put freedom of the press, freedom of the news media into the First Amendment. They wanted to make sure you had that freedom. And of course, the First Amendment, which we've covered, includes freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, that's the news media, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition the government. So the founding fathers wanted to make sure that if there were events, the government couldn't come to the news media or couldn't go to the news media and say, you're not allowed to report on this event. Or the government couldn't go to news media, or the government can't go to news media and say, this is what you have to say about the Boston Tea Party. Because if the government controls the news media, the government has a lot of control over how people perceive events. And that is something that is so important and something that is very powerful. So freedom of the press is very important. Now, in the modern world, is the press always honest? No. In fact, I would argue that the majority of the time they're actually very dishonest. But that's a talk for another day. Eventually, you'll be taking my class on the modern media and the media industrial complex and how the government might not control the media directly, but money is used to control media in the modern world. But I wanted you to understand why freedom of the press, why freedom of news media is in the Bill of Rights. because having an accurate understanding of how different events play out, like accurately understanding what the Boston Tea Party was or what the Boston Massacre was, will directly affect your view on the world. So freedom of the press is so important. And in the modern world, even though some people might try to tell you it's not the case, the truth is we all have cell phones and we have video cameras, and people like you and me are capable of operating as the press. So it's so important that the government doesn't have the authority to tell us what we can and what we cannot report on. So let me know if you have any questions. Let your parents know if you have any questions, and we will catch up next week. And I hope you really think about the importance of honest news media and the impact it could have on your ability to perceive the world around you.